I do think there are some companies when they're going through their earnings cycles as they get to like their quote unquote end of the year that are probably 3 or 6 months ahead thinking we're going to completely restructure that business. We need to shut that line of business down and we need to go focus on this new line of business. In many cases, that could be 3 to 6 months before. But the vast majority that I feel like we're seeing, at least in technology right now, sit in we're going to go through earnings. It's not going to look great for the street. We need to figure out how to cut costs. We need to do it quickly. Labor is the biggest cost that they have. And so that is the way to make that swing. People get very irrational. They start getting into a situation where they aren't performing because they're so nervous or worried about these other things that they kind of psych themselves out. You got to stay very focused on the very rational things that are going on. What is my current world looking like? What do I control in that current world? Maybe you should be saving a little bit more money. Maybe you should be making sure that you're out there making work connections. You're using a product like your product to start collecting references in advance. Like there are things that you can start to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should just automatically assume the worst. AI is making people more productive, and the spirit of it is that we ideally can be getting rid of a whole bunch of things that we were manually doing for a long time. And maybe that will cause a removal of jobs. However, the idea that if you are still going to have actual humans in the workplace and that they don't really need management is bullshit. Like it just is. We have 100 years or more in the last few decades that really have shown, and we have hundreds of thousands of studies that will tell you the impact of a good manager or the detriment of a bad manager. Humans need structure, they need clarification, they need someone who's going to tell them how they're performing, all those kinds of things.
This is Talent Without Pretense, where we're going to be talking about the hard conversations associated with a RIF. That's a highly publicized, it's a highly politicized scenario. And then in addition to that, if you don't know me, my name is Gerald Gordon. I am the co-founder of Reference Me, and we focus on supporting companies when they have to make that hard decision to do a RIF. We want to be there to help those employees that they care about actually find their next roles. And that's our primary purpose. But for today, I have Colleen with us. And before I go into any more details, I know firsthand what Colleen's leadership has been like. I've seen us go through COVID. I've seen us go through making sure that everybody was paid fairly. I've seen her go through the IPO. I've seen the hard discussions. I've seen a situation in which anybody else probably would have taken an easier road, but Colleen always gave us the real of what's happening behind the scenes.
Thanks, Gerald. Happy to be here.
Okay, so we're going to jump right in. And I use this term a lot. We're not going to have virtual backgrounds. And metaphorically, what that means is we're going to have an open conversation about what is really going on with all of these risks that we're seeing. And I couldn't think of a better guest to have to give us some insight in that. So here's my first question. As a technology executive leading in public and private companies, what have you noticed in recent years regarding RIFs that is truly an injustice to all parties involved?
Yeah, I think the biggest injustice I would say is the break of the employee and employer contract. And I think many of the risks we've been seeing for the last, I would say, probably since COVID timeframe have been the result in many cases, not all, but a lot of them, especially at the bigger technology companies, of a lack of restraint and a lack of sort of financial discipline and a lack of systems. And then when things, sort of earnings are coming up, or now these AI, sort of infrastructure expenditures that need to happen, or frankly, in many cases, just like a new way of working that people want to implement, the result, unfortunately, is that, employers are breaking that sort of quote unquote virtual contract that they've had with employees. And instead of doing these other things. Like I often liken layoffs to a diet drug that many people would take right before they go on vacation. They're trying to get skinny to get into their bikini. And the reality is there are certainly cases that, the company's in very bad trouble. It's financially, there are problems. There are a lot of kinds of things. But the reality is, in many cases, if you just have, like we all should be doing with ourselves, eat right, exercise, 80, 90% of the time, you're sort of doing these disciplined behaviors, you shouldn't need to go through a layoff cycle, barring sort of gigantic sort of financial outcome, customers dropping, markets tightening. I would imagine with the gas price situation in certain industries, like there are companies that are going to be affected by these, sort of external circumstances. The travel industry during COVID, right? Like some of these kinds of things. But what we're seeing now, and to my, sort of most of my opinion, is these companies have record revenue growth, they have record profits, and yet here they are, sort of hiring and then letting go of people willy nilly.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of this virtual contract. It's not a real contract. It is in some countries, but for most workers, the idea of like if I come in, I know what my expectations are. I'm delivering at or above those expectations. Generally, you feel like okay, my job should be safe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And certainly when you don't meet those qualifications, right? That's performance management. That's a very different conversation than, sort of blanketly cutting a certain percentage of your workforce to hit whatever, sort of target sitting in front of you.
See, like in my mind, I always thought a company couldn't really be doing that just for profits, right? There's got to be some other major reason why they would get rid of a department or it's no longer serving them. But sometimes in the back of your mind, you're like, I hope that they're not letting people go because they're just trying to meet a revenue number versus actually doing new business in order to actually get a revenue number. And then lastly is when you see how all of these companies are doing a similar playbook, it really does make you wonder, like, what is actually happening here? So if you can walk me through when a company, it's not that they're going to do the RIF, but let's say they are thinking about a reduction. What's the first thing that you start hearing that comes up as they start thinking about doing this? Because normally good companies should be doing this 3, 4, 5 months or even 6 or 8 months ahead of time. They had some conversations that brought them to this scenario in which they decided that they have to do a RIF. Like a lot of us who may have been on the other side, we're only seeing the result, but there's got to be some conversations that are happening earlier. And I wonder from your perspective, what does the earlier situation look like when they're thinking, I need to do a RIF or the board is pushing me to do a layoff? Like, what does that look like?
I think you're giving a lot of credit to many management teams to, sort of have all these things figured out. And I want to make sure that we're, kind of segregating different scenarios, right? So there is a situation where there are companies that use a RIF as performance management. So that is a set of companies that I have seen and I have met their leaders later because that's what they assume they have to do. So there are certain companies, I think the video game industry in a lot of cases ends up working this way. Project based work, like, sort of hey, we just, finished this big launch and we don't need this whole set of people anymore. And so instead of doing performance management throughout the process or being disruptive at any point in time, they just wait to the end or they
Uh,
wait to the end of the year, those kinds of things. I think the lever, so there's this other case scenario where there is a lever that people always assume that this is the easiest and fastest lever to cut costs. And so for a lot of people, it's just in the back of their heads, right? And I don't necessarily know if it's 3 or 6 months before. I do think there are some companies when they're going through their earning cycles as they get to like their quote unquote end of the year, whatever that happens to be, you have to know what your fiscal year looks like, that are probably 3 or 6 months ahead, thinking like, we're going to completely restructure that business. We need to do something different with that business. We need to be bringing in, we need to shut that line of business down and we need to go focus on this new line of business. In many cases, that could be 3 to 6 months before. And that those things could be happening, but the vast majority that I feel like we're seeing, at least in technology right now, sit in this. We're going to go through earnings. It's not going to look great for the street. We need to figure out how to cut costs. We need to do it quickly. And, like I said before, like this is the biggest in most companies, labor is the biggest cost that they have. And so, I don't think that's as planful as that. I think if it was, this is where I get frustrated with a lot of companies that they're just not putting the discipline in place, right? Like they're not saying, don't hire. Like the easiest way to avoid a layoff is not to overhire. Be very strict about hiring or be really focused on we only are going to add this many people this year and we're only opening positions for this many people, or we're going to have to go down, which means as we're performance managing people out, maybe we're not backfilling those roles, right? Like those are things that I feel like smaller companies are just better at, and the bigger companies lose that discipline and focus. But they don't have to. I mean, I think that there are, especially with AI, there's a lot of, ways that you could be implementing early. And that's why I like the metaphor so much of like, make good choices when you're eating the right foods and working out and those kinds of things. Like I think it really works for that scenario. So, and I do want to go back. You said something about like, it's hard as an employee to think about like, well, they're not just cutting my job because they're trying to make profits. Yeah. I mean, most companies are for profit businesses.
Sure.
And so they do have this balance of responsibility to, you know, employees, to customers, to shareholders. And that's the tricky balance of a management team is trying to, which of these three things do you focus on and when and how and why? I think the frustration for employees is when employers misset those expectations, right? All of a sudden you're going through and, taking away someone's job, their livelihood, their, sort of potentially their ego, I mean, all of the things that are wrapped up in your career for no apparent real reason other than sort of profitability. But don't get me wrong, like that is the function of most businesses,
Mhm.
unless a B Corp or a nonprofit or something like that. So
I remember when I used to think about this and think, okay, so our culture matters, right? We have everybody aligned to this culture that we are expecting to experience, especially when you initially get hired. And then something like a RIF, and you don't feel like they've taken the precautions to really take care of their people. Then you wonder, well, was the culture really what they said it was? Didn't
yeah.
stand the tense that it didn't stand up against the situation where a company says, I need to do something in order to line my pockets or make the earnings look good for the street, as you mentioned. Let me ask a deeper question within the question. So we are talking about RIFs, but inside of that, there's this notion of, okay, who do you choose part of these RIFs, right? In some cases, I get it. They're like, if this person isn't performing, instead of actually trying to help them get to where they need to go, which maybe is, a challenge to management. But outside of that, how do they decide which areas they're going to cut? And if it is a for profit thing, then do employees have to be concerned if they're working on the side of the balance sheet that's only on the saving side and not on the growth side? So I'm curious from your perspective, what does that look like when they decide, okay, we do need to do something? So now who do I actually let?
Yeah, I think that's a much harder that I mean, it's a much harder there's no standard answer, right? And I think it's very company dependent in a lot of cases. I think the practical answer is a lot of people will do I'm going to take a little bit from everything, right? The easiest thing is to like go around and I want to, cut at the edges. Sometimes it's very mathematical too of, hey, this organization grew X percent this, past year or 2 years, but everybody else only grew this percent. So, there may be some obvious answers. It could be higher costs, higher cost locations versus lower cost locations. That could be both, domestically and within a country or internationally. Like, is
Mm,
there a way that work done differently? This is where I think it could be an answer, although I don't think it is the real answer in most of these layoffs. Like, people are mimicking, but it could be that hey, there's a technology solution. I think QA testing is a really good example of an area that has seen a lot of this over the years as it's gotten more and more automated. There's been less and less need in many cases for manual testers. And so those groups, I think the G&A groups, someone who's in HR, you might not be recruiting for a while. So recruiters are often the first ones out the door. Marketing in a lot of cases. There are these sort of easier targets, I think. Or, what I think is actually healthier, in my opinion, if you're really going to have to do this, like if you have to make these hard calls, is when you're not picking and choosing who on the team, but maybe you're going to shut down a whole location, right? And like it's everybody. It feels way less personal. It feels way, less intense, or an entire team, like we're just cutting the entire team. The harder part with those kinds of things is sometimes there are these superstars and you're
Right.
just like, oh, I'm going to lose these people. And the reality is a true riff is not about a person. It's
Hmm.
about getting rid of these roles. And then, if you are going to get rid of 90%, you have to make some sort of call in some sort of
Yeah.
way. I mean, I will say companies that do this well, it is a last resort. They don't do it very, a riff well, which is a horrible oxymoron, but like, it's a last resort. There isn't any other path. They're very clear as to what and how and why, how they're going to prevent it from happening again. And they are looking to do this as surgically as possible. Where we're going to do this, it would cause the least amount of pain and survivor guilt. Every company is a little bit different in
Yeah.
terms of what that looks like. And I mean, to be honest, like one of the reasons why I think for a lot of people, using that phrase, like, we're all a family at work and those kinds of things is, always like a little bit distasteful because, you don't fire your family. And that's why so many people have gravitated to these sports teams references. But even then, that doesn't necessarily hold water because it's not like you all of a sudden decide like, well, instead of putting 11 people on the field, I'm only going to put 8 people on the field, right? It works to an extent. But again, I think, so no one is really quote unquote safe. I think the best thing that you could do, maybe this is a different question, but like, one is you should always, and now, especially with AI, always be paying attention if you're a public company in particular to the earnings calls.
Yeah.
A lot of information comes out of those earnings calls. You can know where things are, what divisions are doing well, what are not, where the company is saying that they're going to go. A lot of times they can be alluding to certain projects. They can be alluding to potential cost cutting that they may need to do, like, and start to listen for those things and, kind of make decisions around that. I also think like, hey, being one of those people who is a go-to person in general, not just about one thing, but about multiple things, right? So, those people stand out and if they are, if you are someone who's over delivering and constantly like, hey, I'm going to do that and I'm the person that is trusted to get things done, you're probably in a better situation, just in general around those kinds of
Hmm.
things. And then also, sort of looking for signs. Cutting back travel is often, one of the first things that are looking, cutting out learning and development. I always tell people like in any of these situations, like let's say it happens and you're a survivor and you're like, oh my God, it's gonna happen again, or what should I do? Or I think it's coming. It's the don't be emotional, be rational. I'm a very emotional person. So very emotional things that happen. The people get very irrational. They run away. And then, they start getting into a situation where they aren't performing because they're so nervous or so worried about these other things that they kind of psych themselves out. They don't take on anything new at the company because they're like, oh, but that's a new thing that might go away. Like you got to like stay very focused on the very rational things that are going on. Like, what is my current world looking like? What do I control in that current world? You could be, hey, maybe you should be saving a little bit more money. Maybe you should be making sure that you're out there making more connections. You're using a product like your product to start collecting references in advance. Like there are things that you can start to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should just automatically assume the worst and go
Yeah.
into the worst space.
And I think that that's incredible advice. It's interesting. Sometimes I think everybody knows this. And then you start having
Yeah.
a conversation and you're like, no, they don't know this. So that's really interesting to me because when I was growing up, my mom would say, you must have common sense. But as I got older, I was like, everybody doesn't think the same. And so it's interesting when I hear you say this. So I absolutely love that. If we was to talk about, and a lot of people don't talk about this, the people who survive.
Mm.
What happens when you're in an HR role? The changes happen. People have been let go. Let's say it's a month later. Now we have to kind of rebuild this major cut. It's like losing an arm, and then the rest of your body now still has to manage, even though the arm is gone. So, can you speak a little bit to what happens when you survive that type of thing?
Yeah, I think the survivor guilt is something that people don't talk a lot as much about. And, it's really interesting. Some of the things I've heard over the years, like after having to do a riff or having gone through them, is like, well, we could have just cut the snacks and we could have saved more jobs. We could have cut the snacks. You're right. We could have probably saved a couple of jobs. You don't tend to save a lot of jobs by the snacks, but then the people who are staying on kind of like the snacks. What happens to your culture when you no longer have the snacks? I mean, I don't think snacks are really culture, but I think it's just part of this metaphor for these other things around. And I think the best companies have looked at every option before cutting jobs. Like I do think the sort of more people focused companies have looked at like, can I cut back on the snacks? Can I cut back on training? Can I, cut back on certain other perks that we're offering or those kinds of things? Like before you get to, again, going before you get to this last resort, there's this healthy balance of the people who are staying at the company aren't going to want necessarily to have to feel all these additional changes if they don't have to. So you're still trying to maintain a level of competitiveness in terms of like, hey, this is a, place that people want to work. And so it is hard, and people may have lost their friends at work. And so I think that leadership can do is really give people the vision of where things are going and then a level of commitment, I hope, that they can live up to around these things not happening again. Right. So you're not constantly like you're like I think the worst companies right now are the ones that are doing these like continual layoffs over and over and over. I just think it's wrong. I don't understand what they're doing. I don't understand why. I don't understand. I mean, I get really angry. There was a post during when I was still at Credit Karma, and there was a post by another big technology company by their head of HR that has, about mental health and how important mental health was. At the same time, they had been doing like rounds and rounds of RIFs with
Mm,
work profits, And so I just went off on LinkedIn. Like I just couldn't handle it anymore. I thought it was so tone deaf and so painful. And I have never gotten so many unsolicited like people I don't know reaching out to me than the one time that I made that post. There were all these people I'd never met before who were, sort of having the same exact feeling. So it's hard to be a survivor in a lot of cases. The management team has to be doing something to give more clarity and context and commitment, I think, to people to help them get through to the other side. So I do, I want to go back one thing is I do think there are situations that are out of control. I just, sort of have been going through an acquisition. Our leadership doesn't get to decide some of these things anymore. And so, we have a new owner, we have a new management team that's making decisions. And so those are the, and so when you're caught in that situation, it is challenging for everybody. I think acquisitions in general
mm.
are challenging for a lot of reasons. And so there's only sometimes so much certain people can do to prevent things or do it right, which is generally my thing. At least if you have to do it, you're being told you have to go do this thing, there's a way you can do it. And then also though, but it is the survivors that are still running that, like in my situation of going through this current acquisition, like, the parent company that bought us were very clear about making all these cuts and they decided, not us, but we're still having to, function and deliver and, sort of nurture all of the employees that are still here. And I think good, not just HR teams, but good managers and leaders recognize that, give people some time to space to process, but then give them a focus for the future. So that again, you're back into controlling for the work that I'm doing here is valuable. I feel like it's valuable. I'm my purpose is here and I understand that.
Absolutely. I have two questions in my mind, and this is just a phenomenal conversation. Thank you for providing the insight that you're providing. And so this really helps hone in, especially I would say those who are on the senior side, right? Like those who are at the beginning of their careers, they just know they've been cut. But those who've been with companies for a long, they really should have a perspective of what's actually happening because it is going to matter. So I have two questions in my head, and these are the last two questions.
That's okay.
I'm trying to figure out like how to put it, but one, I've been reading a lot that because AI can make an employee a super employee, because now they have the ability to be an artist, to be a coder, to be a product person, to be a business person, and all of that. So therefore, we don't need as many managers, and therefore AI is causing companies to become flatter because we don't need as many managers because they're doing X, Y, and Z. That's one thought that I had, a question. And I'll throw this one out there too, just to think about it. But what happens to the people who've been laid off? Is HR allowed to work with them still? Or is it like a clean cut? Don't talk to them. We don't engage with them. We're not helping them with their, like I said, I have references, but we also do interview prep. We do all types of stuff to help these executives find their next role. Is there a responsibility for HR to continue on helping those individuals, or it's like they're cut off and we gotta, worry about the survivors? So those are two. One is the AI cutting out middle management, because you have individuals who can do more with less. Is that a reality? What are you seeing there? And then our last question is for those people who have been laid off, how much involvement does the people team have with those individuals? I realize that it's per company, but from your perspective, I like to understand that.
Yeah. So on the AI question, I mean, I think this is another bullshit line. Sorry to anybody who gets offended. I use four-letter words. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's total bullshit. Like, I think yes, AI is making people more productive, and the spirit of it is that we, ideally can be getting rid of a whole bunch of things that we were manually doing for a long time. And maybe that will cause a removal of jobs. However, the idea that if you are still going to have actual humans in the workplace and that they don't really need management is bullshit. Like it just is. We have, 100 years or more in the last few decades that really have shown, and we have hundreds of thousands of studies that will tell you the impact of a good manager or the, detriment of a bad manager. Humans need structure, they need clarification, they need someone who's going to tell them how they're performing, all those kinds of things. Now, have we potentially drifted into the world where we had too many managers or too many levels? Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah. And that goes back again to the discipline of like, what are we hiring? How are we structuring our teams? Do we need to hire new managers or layers? Should we, sort of instead be growing teams in different ways? Should we have smaller organizations with a little bit more of player coach where people are, still in the weeds? Like when I have a head of recruiting, I expect that person to still carry some recs. I always have. I just think it's good. It's fresh. It keeps your mind sort of in it. You're in the game. You're using the tools. You're using the systems. Like I believe, it's a little bit of this idea of eating your own dog food, those kinds of
Absolutely.
things. But this narrative well, because of AI, we don't need managers anymore. That's crap. Like this is just like we've created too many levels. And it's likely too that they've set up their reward systems. So their performance reviews, those kinds of things, based on the size of your organization or what your title is or how many levels you have or those kinds of things, instead of focusing on like what is the real work that this person is delivering.
Mhm.
Because I've equally seen people who are the vice president of sales who are, running a 15,000 person organization or they're running a, sort of 15-person organization. And granted, the compensation set that you would be using would be very different for those sized companies. You could still be a VP of sales, but in both cases, do you really need, does the person who's got the 15,000 people underneath them, do they need 9 layers below them? No, they do not. Like,
Mhm.
like there are ways to structure these teams so that they're smaller and more nimble in the 15,000 person organization, just like they are in the 15-person organization. I do think I am concerned about people, sort of saying like, I'm not going to use AI and that will protect my job, which I sort of seen. And I was like, that's dumb. Like, do not be that person. But I think the scenario of Silicon Valley in particular and technology, which is it's very easy to just parrot and mimic what everybody else is doing. And then, as I say, they go to the lowest common denominator of the worst effect. And then everybody's just sort of doing it. And I'm certain you're going to see this like rotation back again. That people do need the structure. They do need managers. They do need those people. And it's a little bit like I make jokes about HR. Like I feel like, I feel like I have some good job security because, there is no LLM that can define Gerald or can define Colleen or all those kinds of things. Everybody on the planet is born with a different operating system and a different manual. And it's, that's gonna be a lot harder. There's a lot of pattern matching. Like that's a lot of my job, which is like, hey, in general, humans tend to do these things. But I have seen some of what are considered the smartest, most talented people in the world make some of the dumbest decisions when it comes to their personal behavior or choices at work or those kinds of things. So
Right.
I haven't seen AI really get to that level yet. Maybe they will. But so your other question on like, can HR help? Should HR help? What should they do after? I think there are a lot of choices around that. My current company, we are in a situation where we notified everybody at the beginning of this acquisition of their future date, if they had a date. So if they were going to be let go, when they were going to be let go. Some people more than a year away that we told them like a year from now, your job is going away because we just wanted to be done and over and have everybody. And then we also made the first cut, like the first day that, sort of people were actually going to be out of a job 6 weeks later. So people had some
Mhm.
time, get prepared, wrap things up nicely, be good colleagues. And then we set up a whole infrastructure internally of like, here's how to job search. We had our recruiters build all of this out, even though they were losing their jobs in many cases. But
Wow.
here's how to use AI for your job search. Here's how to do your interviewing tips. Here are some great AI trainings. Here's because for some people, maybe they haven't been out in looking for a job in the last 5 or 10 years, and you want to make sure that those people are prepared. And then our recruiters volunteered to do one-on-one coaching
Wow.
before those people left to help them, review resumes and do interview practice and talk about how to search and what are the best tools and what are about places. And then we built an app so when these people left, that they would still have access to all of those tools and resources. And then they could also be part of an alumni community. So we really invested and engaged, and my CEO was super supportive that we wanted, I think he and I both felt really badly about the situation of like, hey, this acquisition needed to happen. It was a great outcome for shareholders. It was financially a good outcome for employees for the most part, other than those who were going to lose their jobs, obviously. And it was where the industry is going and those kinds of things. But at the same time, like we wanted to help people find their next opportunities.
Mhm.
Companies do give money or they have, contracts with certain services, outplacement. I think there is a role for outplacement, but I think like where your world is going is much more of the world that works versus, and we were of the belief system it's better to just give people money that they can use the way they want to. So they can go find whatever services they needed versus being, having locking people into like you can only use the services from XYZ. And then can we help them after? Yeah, I mean, unless you were a jerk to me, I'm probably, and unless you're, or if you're, I will say, if you are engaged in litigation with the company, you're certainly not going to get any extra help or attention for obvious reasons. But if you're someone who has exited gracefully and somebody's coming back around, they have questions, they want a referral, my CEO's been the same way, like happy to help people make connections as
Mm.
possible. I think those are the things that people could be doing and should be doing. So
First of all, you all built an app with the same people that potentially were getting laid off.
yeah, no, they helped us build all of it. Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that is different, right? Like that's a level of empathy that you usually don't see in this market. And I remember seeing that LinkedIn thing because I was so impressed with the tools that they were giving and the knowledge that they were sharing as a community to help people when they were caught in this particular situation. So says a lot about leadership. It also says a lot about the people there. It reminded me also of this altruistic piece where we created that voting app. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
And it,
I still have the hoodie at from Credit Karma, the voter roadmap. Yeah,
right? That
yeah,
was, you could think about companies and how they navigate, but when they do things like that, it really just gives a huge advantage back to what we think corporations can be. And so that was one thing that I sit back and I go, we could have done nothing, but they got together voluntarily and created this place where people can go to learn how to go to find their voting polls and things like that, which actually made a huge difference. That was amazing. And this to me, the same thing. I've never heard of a company, either they're going to move you to some sort of outplacement services.
yeah.
They will give you a severance in some cases, but to actually come together and say, hey, we know that this is hard. Let's make it a little bit easier by creating this environment. That's incredible. So kudos to your all leadership and helping drive that. Because a lot of these things have to come from the top down in order for everybody to be engaged, use their time and all of that stuff. So I just think that that's incredible.
Yeah, I was really, I'm really proud of the team that helped me put it together and not, working for a CEO that, also wanted to be committed.
I always see you connect with the right CEOs that can appreciate how we want to treat people. And I've seen you do that time and time again. So kudos to you. You might have to put that in a book somewhere and
Uh,
learn about the best way to choose their CEO. In addition to that, do you have anything else that you'd like to share? I just think this was really powerful, insightful, and really can bring a lot of clarity to people. And I know for one, I'll be listening to it over and over again because I times you hear it once and then you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like it just gives you another layer of understanding. But if there's anything else that you'd like to share, I know that people can find you on LinkedIn. I don't know if you'll respond to them, but if they wanted to reach out to you and just kind of comment on some of the things that you shared already, you can find Colleen on LinkedIn. But in addition to that, is there anything else that you like? People who listen to this podcast are usually ones who have been impacted by a RIF or their companies who are thinking about an outplacement service or they are just curious because they're inside and they don't know what to do and they're trying to think about different things. Is there anything that you'd like to share with them, or we covered everything in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the only thing the last thing I would leave with people is, the world is big, but your connections are small. And I mean that in the sense of you never know who you're going to, come back in circle with. You never know, everybody is just a couple degrees away from somebody else, and your reputation matters. Your values are, to me, your values are your brand, and that's your reputation. And but how you treat people and what you do both when you're in the company and how you exit, and then, sort of how you leave later, all those things will matter. And so, I've made it a point to stay connected to lots of people over the years. And then I'm shocked, or not shocked anymore, but always excited when, somebody comes back around the company I'm at now. It was great when I first started to have people who are like, oh, I worked with you, 3 companies ago, and
Wow.
told the CEO like, "Oh, we loved, she was great." Or, people who said like, "Oh, I know people who worked at Credit Karma and did this stuff with them." Or and, yeah, sure, I've been on these management teams, and so maybe more people know me, but I see it at all levels. So lead nicely, the best way possible. And so your, current colleagues are your, future teams and your future references and those kinds of things. So don't take it for granted.
I absolutely love that. All right. So, everyone, this is a wrap. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. And again, I always look at it as no virtual backgrounds. We are just going to share with you in real time what actually happens behind the scenes, especially from an operator, technology leader as Colleen. I want to thank you so much for joining us on Talent Without Pretense.
Thank you.